beautiful melody was written by my teacher Marcel Moyse. It's the first etude in his book 24 Petites Etudes Mélodiques, which Marcel Moyse wrote to illustrate typical musical language and phrasing. This first melody, I think, is a real classic because it illustrates a typical three-part melody. Composers often say things 3 times and then give a little tail, a little ending. Moyse said that Mozart said things 3 times and then smiled, and Beethoven said it 3 times and then cried. So here we have a very typical 2-bar rise and fall shape. Which is like speech in that there are strong syllables and weak syllables, strong notes and weak notes. Oh yes, I love you. So it's very typical to crescendo to the first note after the bar line and then come away. Sometimes composers, in order to make it abundantly clear that they want you to bring out that first note after the bar line, will put a special kind of note on the strong beat called an appoggiatura, Italian word meaning to lean or to press. So this is a note which is not in the chord. It rubs against the bass note and it forms a dissonance. So that's what you bring out, like bringing out chili peppers in your stew. And then invariably it will resolve stepwise or half-stepwise, either up or down, to a note which is in the chord, and then you would relax or come away. So very often you have this typical rise and fall shape, and then often the composer will say it again, maybe a little higher, with a little bit more emphasis. And then very often a 3rd time, which will complete the thought, and then maybe there's a little ending. So again, it's like speech. It's like a play where you take a thought and you develop it. It's like, I really love John. I really love John. I want to marry him. And then we can live happily ever after. Or it's like a chain of mountains. Moyse said that when he was writing this, he looked out on the mountains outside his home in Saint-Amour, France, and he saw a mountain that had this rise and fall shape, but it didn't come down all the way to where it started, because then there was another mountain that started up with the same shape, only higher, and again didn't come down all the way, because then there was a 3rd mountain that went all the way up and came down and completed the thought. In the Baroque era, composers assumed that the performers would add in their own ornaments, especially in slow movements. For example, the slow movements of Handel's beautiful flute sonatas are very plain, and he expected that the performers would add in all kinds of ornaments, passing tones, trills, appoggiaturas, etc., in order to, as one writer of the time put it, lend delight to the ear. Now later composers, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert, and beyond, were control freaks. They were micromanagers. They added in their own ornaments. So sometimes when playing their music, the performer can, as it were, decompose the music, take out those ornaments to find the plain structure, to find the line, in order to figure out how to phrase it, how to shape it. So for example, in this little etude number 1 by Moyse that I just played, I could add in my own ornaments. Then I would need to take out those notes that I just added in order to find the plain line and figure out how to phrase it. I talk in more detail about this first etude in a 2015 NFA convention recording. There's a video of me with Paula Robeson on YouTube. Also, there's a video on the website of Flutistry Boston where I talk about this etude. Marcel Moyse, of course, was a great French flute soloist who, in early 20th century Paris, premiered works by Debussy, Ravel, and Stravinsky. I was really lucky to get to study with him starting when he was 85 and I was 19. I took some notes on what he said about his own etudes. Some of the things he said were, take pleasure, don't show off. Little by little, I become warmer. We are here to develop what is beautiful. Players sometimes play so fast, there is no time to take pleasure or to organize the music. Now looking at Etude number 2, this is another beautiful melody which has 3-part phrase shapes and a tail. So in this case, every measure outlines a little rise and fall shape. And what is that shape? It outlines a chord, in this case an A minor chord. You have an A and a C, which is the third, and then a passing tone, the B, going back down to the A. So very often when we outline a chord, it's the first note on the downbeat, which is the root or the bottom of the chord, and that note can get a little extra richness, which forms a gesture. Da-dee-da-yum. What is a gesture? In ballet, it would be the whoosh or the motion of the arm. You wouldn't break it up with little motions like that. It's all one gesture. And the same thing with the air. A gesture is a whoosh of the air. So you play notes on that whoosh of air without accenting anything. You wouldn't want to go. So you want to find gestures. And very often the gesture grows out of the bottom note, as we were saying. On the piano, if you were to play a chord, the bottom of the chord would be the most rich note. You might go ya da 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 dee, and you wouldn't accent da, the top note, with your pinky. So the same way on the flute, you don't always accent the high note if it's not on a strong beat. One way to illustrate the shape of the chord, of the phrase, the shape of the phrase, is kind of a shorthand way of doing this, is to show the first note of each measure, and each downbeat is a little richer than the one before, so that in and of itself would create a phrase. In this case, all of the downbeats in the first phrase are the note A, and the third time you play it, it's so rich that it jumps up the octave. This is what oboists like to call playing a concerto on one note. They quote a famous oboe teacher who said that. In the second 4 bars, again, we have 4 little gestures, each outlining a chord. And again, you could have a shorthand way of showing the phrase development by playing just the downbeats. But in the 4th measure, I didn't actually play the downbeat. I played the E, which is the 3rd beat. Why is that? Because what happens on the downbeat? That F natural. What is the F natural? It is an appoggiatura. My students know that when I ask a question, if they answer appoggiatura, 90% of the time, they will be correct. So Moyse said, why did he put the appoggiatura? Because he loves a note. He said it's like putting a flower in the window or hanging an ornament on the branch. So you bring out the F and then you relax it to resolve on the E. Then Moyse has his own little variation here, and another way of disguising the melody is to put it all in separate notes. In this case, 8 notes in groups of 3 in the 9/8. But again, we want to show the melodic notes by having the rich color on them ring through the melody. So again, we don't want to accent every beat. If the melody is, we don't want to go, but rather a gesture. Moyse said that he purposely made these etudes simple in order for the young student to learn about music. Or the way he put it was, you don't give a baby strong drink, you give a baby milk. In the same way, you wouldn't give a young student Bach, but you would start with something simple, like these etudes. Now looking at etude number 4, this is again rise and fall, a rise and fall, and a rise and a tail. Each rise and fall over 2 bars, like arches or rainbows. But this time, they're all in little separate notes, which Moyse said were like bells. So in talking about bells, Moyse was thinking of how you ring a bell. It has a beginning impetus or impulse, and then it decays or diminuendos. So when we do that on the flute, I think of bringing my lips forward and up as I decay in order to not go flat. My other teacher, Tom Neifinger, had an exercise for this. He said, try diminuendo over 5 beats, over 4 beats, over 3 beats, 2 beats, and then a really quick diminuendo over 1 beat. Neifinger said that that would create an effect like your own ambiance, which you could use if you were playing in a dead room that didn't have any ring to it, so it sounds as though your sound is ringing. So if you did that on a middle D, it might be something like this. So in the Moyse Etude, you would let each note ring until the impetus of the next note. Then Moyse writes a little variation on Etude number 4, and in this case, he puts it all in octaves. But again, the phrase shape is shown by the bottom notes outlining the rise and fall shape. The upper note is just a shadow, a mere shadow of the lower note. So it needs to sound gooey or seamless, jumping up the octave. Again, I think of bringing my lips forward and up to make the octave, and start to move my lips before I play the high note so that it's seamless. Introduce you to our friend over here. This is a statue of Marcel Moyse. A friend of mine made it and gave it to me. Kind of looks like him. Moyse was born in 1889, so he was a genuine link to 2 centuries ago. Next, let's take a look at Etude number 8. This is again a 3-part phrase with a tail, and again it's a series of rainbows or arches. first little rainbow, again, we crescendo to the first note after the bar line. But in this case, that's not the highest note. The highest note is the G, which is on the third beat of the first bar. But do we want to make that the loudest note? No, we don't want it to stick out, but rather. So we save something in order to go to that first note after the bar line. Then he writes a little variation in groups of 3 in a 9/8. When we look back at the original melody, we see that the first measure is one gesture, one whoosh. So we want to make the first measure of the variation the same way. And the C is being ornamented by putting a little lower neighbor. But it could all just be one long C. So we have the air is moving the same way, even though the line is ornamented. Then he has an even more elaborate variation, all in 16th notes. And again, we have to look for the gestures, even though there's a lot of ornamentation. For example, in the first measure, again, we have a long C, but what does he do with it? He goes to an upper neighbor, the D, and then a lower neighbor, the B, and then up a third. So the E flat is a chord tone, and what is the D? It's a passing tone. Passing tone again, and then he outlines the chord. These are all ways of doing Baroque ornamentation, which later composers added to their own music. This is very similar to the type of ornamentation that Schubert uses in his variations. Now let's see how these phrasing concepts apply to some quote-unquote real music. That is the Mozart Concerto in D major, slow movement, which is in G major. Here we have a 3-part phrase of little rainbows, the third part being longer and a tail. Where have we seen that before? So you have this little rise and fall shape, and as usual, what happens on the downbeat of the second bar? The G sharp, right, that is an appoggiatura, resolving to the A. So he could have just written, but to ornament it a little further, he puts that upper neighbor, the B natural. Now, if Mozart were an ordinary composer, he would say it once, and then he might say it again the same way, a little bit higher. So he might have gone, that would have been normal. But Mozart instead took the second bar of his first little phrase shape and put it on the first bar of the second phrase shape. Who does that? Mozart, that's who. So the second bar, then he does it again. Going to yet another appoggiatura on the A sharp. And this one, because the phrase is rising, gets even more richness. Then the third statement is different material. Sometimes composers will do it. They'll say something twice, and the third time is different and reaches a conclusion. This time, Those last two notes sound like what? An appoggiatura and a resolution. But are they? Actually not, because the D is part of a dominant 7 chord. And what is the C? That is the 7th. So it's not appoggiatura or resolution. Both notes are chord tones in a 5-7 chord. Now a 5-7 chord feels dissonant. It hasn't settled down. It wants to go to the 1 chord. In this case, it's going to G major, which doesn't happen until the end of the next bar. Then he has another phrase with, again, a 2-part rainbow. But in this case, instead of going up, the phrase goes down. And yet, we're still going to that 2nd bar, which has an appoggiatura. So now the phrase is developing, but the notes are going down. This is something that the flute doesn't want to do. The flute tends to want to get weaker as it goes down. So we have to learn how to develop the sound as the notes get lower, especially in the low register. Moyse would say this is like putting the spoon in the mayonnaise. I would think of dropping my jaw as I go down. So again, we have some Baroque ornamentation, so to speak. We have that one little phrase shape going down into the appoggiatura on the D sharp, which resolves to the E. But he puts a little upper neighbor. Then an ornament, and then what are these things? Right, they're just little appoggiaturas, but the most important appoggiatura is the next one, the C sharp, because it's on the downbeat. So there can be gradations of importance with appoggiaturas. So we're going to the C sharp, which resolves to the D, but in between you have ornamentation. So that's all in one gesture. You don't have to accent notes in the middle of this coming away gesture. Then it goes up, another appoggiatura, another appoggiatura. Is that one an appoggiatura? No, that again is a dominant 7. Here again, he's ornamenting. He gives an appoggiatura, which actually goes to, but in between, he has a flight of fancy, which is ornamentation. So we see this kind of language, a bigger phrase shape, sometimes with ornamentation hung on it. And we can find this in, as I mentioned, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, on to Brahms, Schoenberg, and even into 20th century and 21st century music. So we can look for these shapes in order to figure out how to phrase the music. Even in something as seemingly modern as Edgar Varese, we can find this kind of language. In his Density 21.5, which he wrote in 1936, the first note has a line over it. The first note is an F natural, so it sounds like this. Why did he put a line over that F natural? Well, I think that it's because it's reminiscent of an appoggiatura resolving on an F sharp, the F to the F sharp. And what is that E? It's a little lower neighbor. So it's really the same language, it's the same tradition, and we can use this all over. I find that the idea of taking an idea, developing it, and reaching a conclusion is the most important lesson, I think, in Western tonal music. It's more important even than having a beautiful sound or great technique. As important as those things are, You really want to use those tools to say something. Again, it's like speech. You don't want to accent every word, 7 years ago, but you speak in gestures, 7 years ago, and each gesture builds up to reach a conclusion that all men are created equal. So, happy phrasing.